Chapter 14. In early November 2006, some officials from the Malawi teacher training activity were inspecting the library at Wimbe Primary when they noticed my windmill in the schoolyard. They asked Mrs. Sakalo, the librarian, who'd built it, and she gave them my name. One of them telephoned the head office at MTTA in Zomba in the southern region and told his boss, Dr. Hartford McKinsey, what he'd seen. A few days later, Dr. McKinsey drove 5 hours to Wimbe. His driver took him to our house, where he asked my father if he could speak to the boy who built the windmill. "He's here," my father said, and called me from my room. Dr. McKinsey was an older man with gray hair and kind, gentle eyes, but when he spoke, his command of language was large and powerful. I'd never heard anyone speak such good Chichewa, and when he spoke English, it was simply inspiring. "Tell me everything," he said, asking me about the windmill and how it had happened. I explained my windmill, as I had done hundreds of times before, then took him through our house and demonstrated how my switches and circuit breaker worked. He listened carefully, nodding his head, and asked specific questions. "These are very tiny bulbs," he says. "Why aren't you using big ones?" "Big bulbs require AC power," I said. "In order to have many lights, I have to charge a battery, which is DC. These tiny car lights are the only DC bulbs I could find." "How far did you go with your education?" "I dropped the first year of secondary school." "Then how did you know all this stuff about voltage and power?" "I've been borrowing books from your library." "Who teaches you this stuff? Who helps you?" "No one," I said. "I've been reading and doing it alone." Dr. McKinsey then went to see my mother and father. "You have lights in your house because of your son," he said. "What do you think of this?" "We were proud," my mother said, "but we thought he was going mad." Dr. McKinsey laughed and shook his head. "I want to tell you something," he said. "You may not realize, but your son has done an amazing thing, and this is only the beginning. You're going to see a lot more people coming here to see William Kamkwamba. I have a feeling this boy will go far. I want you to be ready." The visit left me a little confused and very excited. No one had ever asked me such questions before, and no one had taken that kind of interest. That afternoon, Dr. McKinsey returned to Zomba and told his colleagues what he'd seen. "This is fantastic," they said. "The whole world needs to know about this boy." "I agree," Dr. McKinsey said, "and I have just the idea." The next week, Dr. McKinsey returned to my house with a journalist from Radio 1. It was the famous Everson Messiah, whose voice I'd heard for years, and here he was at my house to interview me. "What do you call this thing?" he said. "I'm calling it electric wind." "But how does it work?" "The blades spin and generate power from a dynamo." "And in the future, what do you want to do with this?" "I want to reach every village in Malawi so people can have lights and water." 2 days later, while waiting for the Radio 1 interview to air, Dr. McKinsey came to me with even more reporters. These men represented all the great media organizations in Malawi. Mudziwitu and Zodiac radio channels, the Daily Times, The Nation, Malawi News, and Guardian News. They poured out of the car with their cameras and tape recorders and flocked around the windmill. For 2 hours they moved through my house, elbowing and shoving one another to get the best pictures of my switches and battery system. "You've had your time. Now it's my turn," they shouted. "Move aside. My paper is bigger." Soon our yard was filled with crowds from the trading center who'd gathered around to gawk at the famous journalist who'd come to our village. "Look, it's Noel Mukubi from Zodiac," they said. "Finally we see his face. What a handsome man. Look, he's interviewing William." One of the reporters even climbed my tower and studied the blades and pulley system, taking pictures the whole time. "McKinsey, this chap is a genius," he shouted. "Yes," he answered, "and this is the problem with our system. We lose talent like this all the time as a result of poverty, and when we do send them back to school, it's not a good education. I'm bringing you here because I want the world to see what this boy has done, and I want them to help." Dr. McKinsey told us that as a boy he had endured his own setbacks with education. His father had also been a poor farmer who'd struggled to feed and clothe his family. But his father had learned the value of an education. While working in the gold mines of Rhodesia, he'd been denied several opportunities because he'd never gone to school. That failure seemed to haunt him for the rest of his life. At one point, when Dr. McKinsey was young, his family had barely enough to eat. He had volunteered to drop out of school and work so his brothers could go instead. His father refused, saying, "All of my kids will stay in school. I'll do whatever it takes." It took nearly 10 years for Dr. McKimsey to complete his secondary education. When he was 33 years old, he was finally accepted with a scholarship to the University of Malawi in Zambia, later earning master's and doctorate degrees from universities in America, Britain, and South Africa. Before working for the MTTA, he'd written many Malawian textbooks, including my own Standard 8 English Reader. The day after the journalist came to visit, the interview with Everson Messiah finally aired on Radio 1. I was behind the house chatting with my aunt when my mother shouted, "William, come quick, it's on." My family all gathered around the radio, and I heard the announcer say, "A boy in Wimbe, near Kasungu, has made electric wind." When my voice started to come through the speakers, my sisters began to cheer. If the radio show wasn't good enough fortune, the story in the Daily Times was published the next week with a big headline that said, "School dropout with a streak of genius." The story had a photo of me pretending to connect wires to the battery in my room while trying not to smile. That afternoon, I took the paper to the trading center to show everyone what the madman had done. "We also heard you on the radio," people said. "Do you have to go to Blantyre?" "No, they came to me," I answered. "Really? We're very proud. You've represented us well, and we're so impressed at how well you spoke." In a way, it took having these reporters come to my house to make our town finally accept my windmill. I don't know, but I think it was a kind of validation. After the radio and newspaper coverage, the number of visitors to my house increased tenfold. Shortly after the story ran, I started some much-needed improvements on my windmill. I'd realized the big acacia tree behind the latrine was blocking my strongest wind, and I needed to go higher. So with the Daily Times story under his arm, my father was able to convince the manager of the tobacco estate to part with several giant poles, which I used to build a tower that was 36 feet high. Once I moved it away from the tree, the speed of my blades doubled, and so did the voltage. After visiting my house with the reporters, Dr. McKimsey went back to Zambia and gathered his colleagues. "I think this chap should be sent back to school," he said. "He needs to continue his education and develop his abilities. That way, these inventions will be credible and people will respect what he's doing. Without education, he's limited." "We agree," one of his associates says. "Perhaps we can find an organization that can support him." "Eventually, yes," Dr. McKimsey said, "but we need to put him in school as soon as possible. In this office, can we contribute something for his fees?" Dr. McKimsey pulled out a wad of kwacha from his pocket and tossed it on the table. "Look, here's my contribution, my own pay. Who will follow?" By the end of the day, Dr. McKimsey had collected nearly 2,000 kwacha. That week, Dr. McKimsey contacted the Ministry of Education and asked them to find a good school for me to attend. No one answered his calls or letters, so he drove to the office of the head of secondary education. "I sent a letter," he told the official. "We received your letter," she said. "The boy has a very interesting story. We'll find a place for him, but it can't be now." "You people are delaying him," Dr. McKimsey said. "He's growing up, and the more you delay, the more schools will say he's too old. Try to do this faster." The woman said they'd be in touch, but no one called back. Dr. McKimsey returned and was told to go to Kasungu to see the division manager of Central East Schools. Dr. McKimsey got in his car and drove 4 hours to her office. "I've read this kid's story," the woman said. "He's very interesting." "Of course he's interesting, so don't waste his time," Dr. McKimsey said. "He needs to be in school immediately." "There are procedures that must be followed," she said. "Surely you can make an exception. Surely there's some kind of waiver." "Okay," she said. "I'll go and see this windmill myself." While I was in the trading center running errands for my father, the manager of schools came to see my windmill, along with several people from the Ministry of Labor. They wore suits and their faces dripped with sweat as they stood in the hot sun. They didn't explain why they were there. They just asked my mother if they could look around. An official from labor then said to his colleagues, "This boy has special talent. We need to take him in the system. We need people like this in government." When the manager of schools returned to her office, she called Dr. McKimsey. "You're right," she told him. "The boy needs to be in school, and we have just the place. It must be a boarding school, one that specializes in science. Please don't delay." "We'll take it from here," she said. While this was happening, something else amazing was taking place without my knowledge. The day after the Daily Times article ran, a Malawian in the Lilongwe named Soyapi Mumba brought the article to his office. Soyapi worked as a software engineer and coder for Baobab Health, an American-run NGO that's working to computerize Malawi's healthcare system, which is very unorganized with its stacks of old record books. One of Soyapi's bosses, a tall American named Mike McKay, liked the article about my windmill so much that he wrote about me on his blog, Hacktivate. That blog entry caught the attention of Emeka Okafor, a famous Nigerian blogger and entrepreneur who was program director of a big conference called TED Global 2007. Well, Emeka wanted me to apply to be an official fellow at his conference, and for 3 weeks tried very hard to find me. After harassing the reporters at the paper every day, he finally tracked down Dr. McKinsey. In mid-December 2006, Dr. McKinsey came to my house with the TED application. We sat down under the mango tree and he helped me fill in the questions, plus write a small essay about my life. When he left, I still had no idea what TED was, or what it even meant. TED means Technology, Entertainment, and Design, and it's an annual meeting where scientists, inventors, and innovators with big ideas get together and share. I wasn't even sure what a conference was or what people did at such things. The application didn't say where it was held. I suspected Lilongwe but didn't know. I began to imagine myself walking the streets of the capital, seeing all the many kinds of people. People said Lilongwe was filled with thieves, but I wasn't afraid. If anything happened to me, I'd already decided I'd go to the market and ask help from some women. Women will always help you. But what could I wear to this conference? Everything I owned hung from a rope in my bedroom and was red from the roof dust. Even still, it gave me something to dream about. In the beginning of January, just after New Year's, one of Dr. McKinsey's colleagues called Jeffrey's phone. I didn't have a mobile, to pass along a message that I'd been selected for the TED conference. Tell him to get ready, he told Jeffrey. He's going on a journey. Jeffrey didn't know the details, but said Dr. McKinsey would phone me. Later that week, Dr. McKinsey called again. I happened to be standing nearby, and Jeffrey handed me the phone. You're going to Arusha, Tanzania, he said. You'll be honored with other scientists and inventors. People from all over the world will be there. Perhaps something good can come from it. Wow, Arusha. I imagine the bus ride. How long would it take? I'd have to bring plenty of food, perhaps cakes and roasted maize. After all, I had no money. One important thing, he said. We should book your flight before it fills up. I'm traveling by plane? My God. Yes, and they wish to know if you want a smoking or non-smoking room in the hotel. Hotel? I'm staying at a hotel? I thought for sure I'd be sleeping in one of those guest houses near the boozing dens where the poor people stay. Of course you're staying in a hotel, he said. And I have other good news, William. You're going back to school. Finally, after months of haggling with the Ministry of Education, I was given permission to attend Medici Secondary, a public boarding school an hour from my home. It wasn't one of the science-oriented schools that Dr. McKinsey had suggested. The headmasters at those schools weren't willing to accept me on account of my old age and number of years I'd been a dropout. However, the headmaster of Medici, Mr. Ronix Banda, was so moved by my story he offered to spend the extra time helping me catch up. I was so terribly behind. While Dr. McKinsey planned my trip to Arusha, I packed my things and went to school. This was the first time I'd ever lived away from home. I had a black suitcase I'd purchased a few weeks earlier in Lilongwe while visiting Jeffrey's brother Jeremiah, who'd moved to the city a couple years before. Along with a toothbrush and toothpaste, I packed my flip-flops, a blanket, 3 t-shirts, a pair of trousers, 1 nice shirt, 1 pair of socks, and 2 pairs of underpants. The bag had wheels, so I rolled it out through the courtyard and stopped under the mango tree. My parents were waiting, along with Jeffrey. I guess I'll see you soon, I said. Work hard, my father said. I want you to know we're very proud. Jeffrey strapped my suitcase to his bicycle, and we rolled it down the trail towards the pickup stop. Along the way, we stopped at Gilbert's house. We don't have phones. How will we talk? Gilbert asked. It will be difficult, I said. Maybe I can come visit you there. Oh, Gilbert, that would be great. Please do. I'll miss you, friend. For sure. We stopped and waited at the pickup stop, and soon a truck appeared from down the road in a cloud of red dust. Jeffrey waved his hand and flagged down the driver. I'll see you when school ends, he said. When you arrive, find someone with a phone and send me their number. We'll talk this way, and I'll make sure Gilbert is there. That would be good, I said. Take care of my windmill, will you? Let me know everything that happens. Sure, sure, don't worry. I squeezed into the pickup with the other passengers and found a sack of charcoal for a seat, and we rolled on to Kasungu. Once there, I caught a minibus down M1 highway to the small town of Medici. The bus dropped me at a junction on the outskirts of town where a long road led to the school. I walked a kilometer with my suitcase bouncing behind on the gravel road until I stood outside the steel gates. In a matter of minutes I had a dorm room and dorm mates, meal times, and a rigorous schedule of classes. Everything was new and foreign and a little overwhelming, but my God, what a pleasure it was to be learning in a real school. The classrooms in Medici had solid roofs that didn't leak and smooth concrete floors that didn't have holes. Large unbroken windows let in the sunshine, but kept out the cold. I had an actual desk of my own, complete with pencil holder. During study sessions at night, real fluorescent lights buzzed above, at least when we weren't having a blackout. Science class was held in an actual chemistry lab, where the shelves were lined with light microscopes, giant coils of high-resistance wire, glass beakers, and old jars of boric acid. If you can believe it, it was one of the first lessons our teacher, Mr. Precious Chukola, gave us was about the process of current passing through an electric bell. I'd already applied this concept with my windmill and circuit breaker, but having it explained in scientific terms, in English, was like hearing it for the first time. But like every other school in Malawi, Medici relied on the government to survive, and unlike some of the more prestigious boarding schools, it had been neglected. Most of the equipment in the science lab was from President Banda's time, and it was so old that it no longer worked. The chemicals were expired and dangerous, the microscopes rusted and scratched, and for the electric bell lecture we had no working batteries to supply the power. If anyone has an extra dry cell in their rooms, I'll happily demonstrate, the teacher said. No one did, so we simply used our imaginations. Our dorms were dirty, and the walls were covered with graffiti. The urinals in the bathrooms didn't work, so the Form 1 students, namely me, the new guy, had to clean them every day and keep down the smell. The rooms themselves were so cramped that two boys were forced to squeeze into one small bed. My bedmate was a boy named Kennedy, who never cleaned his socks. Hey, man, you need to wash your feet before you come into bed with me, I told him. Sorry, I can never tell, he said. I'll wash tomorrow, promise. But he never did. Often I'd wake up with his feet touching my mouth. I was several years older than everyone else, so some students started teasing me. How many kids did you leave behind at the farm, old man? They shouted. 2 boys, I said, and another one on the way, perhaps next month. The old man thinks he's funny, they said. You spent too much time with your cows, herd boy. One day I decided to end the teasing once and for all. I pulled up the newspaper article about my windmill and put it on the table. Here, I said, this was what I was doing. The boys in my dorm were impressed. Good job, man, they said. How did you manage? No one teased me after that. Really, after 5 years of being a dropout, I was so grateful to be in school. But after a couple weeks in this strange place, plus the loneliness from being away from my home and family, I became a little sad. Often, after class, I'd hide away in the school library, where the books filled rows and rows of shelves. I'd find a chair and study my lesson books in geography, social studies, agriculture, biology, English, and math. I became lost in American and African history, and within the colorful maps of the world. No matter how foreign and lonely the world was outside, the books always reminded me of home, sitting under the mango tree. While I attended school at Medici, Dr. Mackenzie was busy making arrangements for the trip to Arusha. Several months before, he'd helped me get a passport, and since I'd never been on an airplane or stayed in a hotel before, he took me out of school one weekend for a crash course on international travel. I took a minibus 6 hours to Zomba, and we visited the Hotel Masolonga, where many tourists stay. He asked the manager to show me a room, how to fill out the guest cards, and how to order in the restaurant. But since the Masalonga was too expensive, Dr. McKimsey booked me a room at Peter's Lounge. It was my first night in a hotel, and the first time I'd ever slept on a real mattress. Dr. McKimsey had also taken a collection to buy me a smart white shirt and black trousers for my journey. They were the nicest clothes I'd ever owned. He also gave me other useful travel advice. For instance, on a plane, I'd be assigned a seat that was mine and mine only, so there was no need to rush and use your elbows like the minibus. If the red light is on near the lavatory, that means it's occupied, and because some people get upset stomachs on their first plane ride, each seat comes with a paper bag for vomit. I was glad to have that bag because I was certain I would need it. In June, I left school and took a minibus back home to pack. The next morning, a driver appeared to take me to the airport in the long way. "Our son is leaving us and traveling by airplane," my father said to my mother, smiling. "That's right," I said, "flying like a bird in the sky. I'll be waving as I pass over. We'll be watching for you. You'll see us here." My father then tucked a bag of roasted groundnuts in my pocket. They were still warm. That evening in the long way, I was too nervous to sleep, and I stayed up all night in my hotel room watching Supersport. I was still awake when the sun came up and it was time to leave. On the plane, I couldn't believe it, but sitting next to me was none other than Soyapai Mumba, the software engineer from Lilongwe, who'd first seen my article. Because he's a nice guy, he introduced himself, not knowing who I was. When I said my name and where I was going, he said, "Oh my God, William the windmill guy?" And I told him he'd been the one who'd shown my story and told me he'd been the one who showed my story to Mike McKay, who blogged about me on Hacktivate. Soyapai was the very reason anybody had ever heard about me and my windmill, and the reason why I was going to this conference. Now here he was, sitting next to me on the plane. It also happened that Soyapai was a TED Fellow himself, being honored for his coding work with Baobab. I was so happy to meet him. The airplane was bright and clean, and the air conditioning felt so cool and pleasant on such a hot day. What a great place to be. As the plane taxied toward the runway, I gripped the seat, smiling big. I was certain everyone knew it was my first time. The people seated around me were so well dressed and competent. They had important things to do, and their busy lives required them to travel in airplanes across the world. As the jet accelerated down the runway and lifted its nose in the air, I pressed my head back in the seat and laughed. I guess I was now one of them too.